No man in Europe had worked harder for war than Konrad von Hotzendorf, the directing head of the Austro-Hungarian armies. None surpassed him in eagerness. Fate determined that he, of all the military chiefs, should come to grief most utterly in the first clash of the armies. Yet he was, perhaps, the ablest strategist among them. Moltke, Joffre, and the Grand Duke Nicholas were conscientious pedestrian soldiers, with marked differences of temperament, but not of tempo. They were slow-moving and slow-thinking, whereas Konrad had a sense of mobility and an aptitude for bold maneuver. His strategy blended the spirit of an artist with the suppleness of an acrobat. If his ideas were bounded by the walls of the 19th century school of war, they represented its best fruits. Also its worst defect, a failure to appreciate the growing part that material factors play in modern war. Lacking a sense of tactical reality, he would attempt feats of strategic virtuosity for which his instrument was inherently unfitted. When it bent under the strain, he merely pressed on it the harder until it broke in his hands. The Austrian army was the most obsolete in equipment among those of the great powers. Its field guns were fewer in proportion and shorter in range. Some 2/3 of the rifles were of old pattern, a quarter of a century old, and its reserve was so inadequate that, even in September, the troops holding the Carpathian passes had to be issued with single loaders. Its transport was so scanty that it had to be supplemented by a cumbersome collection of assorted farm carts, which congested the roads. Yet with all these hindrances to vigorous action, the training of the Austro-Hungarian army had been devoted purely to the offensive. This infatuation with a tactical impossibility seems to have been due to the influence of Konrad von Hotzendorf, who had himself compiled the manuals on which the army had been trained. If the tactical instrument of his plan was brittle, its strategic foundation was hollow. The Polish salient, deep thrust between the jaws of Austrian and German territory, was on the map a morsel so inviting that any amateur strategist would have jumped at the idea of biting it off. It excited Konrad beyond discretion. He pictured to himself a strategic super Sudan, with his own armies thrusting up from Galicia and the Germans driving down from East Prussia, to cut off the Russian masses in the wide plains of Poland. But this project was not easy to adjust to the practical problem of a double-fronted war conducted by a double-headed alliance. Germany had long decided to concentrate her initial efforts against France. At a meeting in 1909, Moltke had told Konrad that he hoped to settle with France within 6 weeks and then to switch his forces to the Russian front in support of Austria. In view of the German decision, Konrad might wisely have decided to stand on the defensive until the reinforcement came. If he had done so, geography and Russian lethargy would have worked in his favor to gain time. The rivers and streams that run north from the Carpathians would have provided a series of delaying obstacles. And the Russian army's low rate of concentration would have withheld early danger. But, even to gain time, Konrad could only conceive one form of action: the offensive, and, with this obsession, Russia's lengthy process of mobilization served him as a justification. The sooner he struck, the less force he would have to meet. It was calculated that the Russians would have 31 divisions on the Austrian front by the 20th day of mobilization, August 18, rising to 52 by the 30th day. Konrad counted on having available a force equal to the Russians by the first date, whereas he would be in an inferiority of 3 to 4 by the second. To him this was an incentive to prompt action, although to anybody save a military optimist of the 1914 kind, bare equality of strength, and strength of such a dubious quality, might have seemed inadequate odds in launching a would-be decisive offensive. But Konrad also counted on the strength of a vague promise from Moltke in 1909 that the German forces in East Prussia would take the offensive. Although no direction was mentioned and even the intention lapsed, Konrad continued to assume that such an offensive would take place. If the German General Staff bears the responsibility of having failed to undeceive him instead, Moltke indulged in schoolboyish exhortations to thrust the knout carriers into the marshes of the Pripyat and drown them, there Konrad was certainly eager to deceive himself rather than forego the opportunity of displaying his art. His two strongest armies, the 1st and the 4th, were assembled on the left of his line in Galicia for a northward thrust, while the 3rd covered their eastern flank. It was to be joined by the 2nd when this eventually arrived from its circular tour on the Serbian front. Conrad had admitted the possibility that the Russians, instead of assembling to be cut off in the Polish salient, might concentrate for an offensive against his eastern flank. In that case he proposed to swing his armies round to face them, on a line through Lemberg. But, as such a possibility did not accord with his desires, he was more than ready to discount it. This did not prove difficult, thanks to the defective means of information on which he relied. He had over 100,000 cavalry, but a mere 42 aircraft, and of these only a few were serviceable. The Austrian advance was preceded by a great mass of cavalry sent forward on August 15 on a 100-mile excursion to search a front 250 miles wide. Within a few days so many of the horses had sore backs that several entire divisions were put out of action. Only a small proportion came within reach of the enemy, who did not use a cavalry screen. Thus these Austrian cavalry bumped into the Russian infantry, who took heavy toll of them. The Austrian official history candidly remarks that the results of the distant cavalry reconnaissance were not worth the cost of casualties. But the slight indications that he gleaned sufficed to satisfy Conrad that the Russians were assembling according to his plan. So, on the 20th, he gave the fateful order for the northward offensive into the depths of Poland. Groping in the dark, the Austrian infantry pushed on towards Lublin, while Conrad, in false confidence, expressed his belief that there is no sign of any Russian movement from the east, against the right flank. His delusion was soon to be rudely dispersed, for two whole Russian armies were marching against this flank. In contrast to the Germans, Conrad seems to have discovered too late the possibility of intercepting the enemy's wireless orders, although he learnt the trick in time to escape the closing of the net into which he had blindly walked. By comparison, the Russian plan was of shrewd and simple design. It offered two essentially different alternatives, but the initial dispositions were made to suit either. In any event, all the Polish salient west of Warsaw and the Vistula was to be evacuated. The Russian forces were divided into two groups, one assembling on the northwestern front facing East Prussia, and the other on the southwestern front facing East Galicia. Each group comprised 3 armies, with a 4th guarding its outer flank. If the Germans concentrated for an offensive against Russia, the alternative that would be adopted was Plan G, Germania, by which the Russian forces would fall back to a north and south line through Brest-Litovsk, retiring farther if and when necessary, until the arrival of the troops from Siberia and Turkestan enabled them to take the counter-offensive in strength. If the Germans made their main effort against France and remained inactive in the east, Plan A, Austria, came into operation. In this, the southwestern group of armies, reinforced by one from the northwestern, would take the offensive against the Austrians. The remainder of the northwestern group would invade East Prussia. In the light of orthodox theory, this plan of delivering a double attack on two widely separated points and in divergent directions may seem unwise and be too hastily condemned. Its justification lay in the weakness of the German forces in East Prussia and in the importance of a distraction to their effort against France, as the event proved. Also, it would shield the flank of the main offensive and shorten the front if it succeeded, while paving the way for the ultimate advance of the main armies into Silesia. Here were strong arguments. Moreover, it would have been difficult, because of poor communications, for more troops to be used effectively on the Galician side. The defects of the plan were less in the general design than in the conduct of the northern offensive and the crudeness of the instrument. Unfortunately, these defects were aggravated by the pressure which the French applied to the Russian command to accelerate its action. The Grand Duke Nicholas resisted their suggestion that he should advance direct against Silesia, ignoring the enemy on his flanks. But in loyalty to his allies, he began to assemble 2 fresh armies on the center, with a view to such a move as soon as possible. Also, he tried to hasten the execution of his present moves and thereby put a greater strain on the Russian organization than it could safely bear. If the consequences were most harmful on the East Prussian side, where they led to Tannenberg, their effects were felt earlier on the Galician side. Here the Russians, like the Austrians, had a picture of their enemy's plan that was exactly the reverse of the reality. And no more than the Austrians did they have the means of information to correct it. Ivanov, commanding the southwestern group of armies, imagined the enemy moving east. They would be met by his strong 3rd and 8th armies, advancing west. And then his 4th and 5th armies would descend from the north across their rear. A delightful picture. And, although it was incorrectly conceived, it came near to being fulfilled the other way around. The opening, however, was unpropitious. Under pressure from the Grand Duke Nicholas, and contrary to Ivanov's wish, the 4th Army on the extreme west began moving down before its mobilization was complete. In this unready state it collided on the 23rd with the Austrian 1st Army pushing northward. Both were surprised. But in this Battle of Krasnik, superiority of force was on the Austrian side, and it enabled General Dankel to turn the flank of the Russians and drive them back. The news of this reverse was an unpleasant shock to the Grand Duke and Ivanov. But, with eyes still glued on their original picture, they too easily slipped into the deduction that the Austrian stroke came merely from an offensive flank guard, and to punish the audacious intruder, Plev's 5th Army was ordered to wheel westward against his flank and rear, so as to cut him off. Another picture. Unfortunately for the Russians, this wheel presented their own flank to the northward advancing Austrian 4th Army, Offenburg. The clash took place on the 26th. In this Battle of Komarov, the Russians suffered the worst because their own commander was continuing to urge the westward wheel, while the enemy was forcing them to face round to the south. Under this double pressure the Russian 5th Army became badly bent, especially on the flanks, and by the evening of the 28th, it was in grave danger of being encircled by Offenburgs. It might have crumpled sooner if the Austrian cavalry had not fallen a prey to a panic due to their own carelessness, which temporarily unhinged Offenburg's advance. That hitch in drawing close the net had fateful consequences. For the grey waves of the main Russian advance were now rolling on towards Lemberg, perilously close to Offenburg's line of supply and retreat. The caution and cumbrousness of the Russian armies, by acting as a brake on their advance, had helped to keep Conrad in ignorance of the impending menace. And his own temperament had contributed to make this worse. Enthused by the opening success of his northward advance, he had drawn 3 divisions from the weak 3rd Army near Lemberg to increase Offenburg's strength. And at the same time he approved a suggestion that what remained should advance east from Lemberg to strike at the supposedly small Russian forces now reported in that direction. His 2nd Army from the Danube was only just beginning to arrive on the scene at Stanislau in the south. The 3rd Army's rash advance to the Zlotolippa on the 26th was followed by still rasher attacks, unprepared and disjointed, on the heads of the Russian columns, which had a 5-2 advantage in numbers. The Austrians recoiled in disorder to the Neolippa. Lemberg itself, 25 miles behind the battlefield, was filled with panic-stricken fugitives that night. Next morning Conrad ordered the battered 3rd Army to fall back on Lemberg and sent word to Offenburg to return the 3 divisions loaned to him. Conrad, indeed, was about to halt his 2 northbound armies when news came that the Russians were not pursuing their progress. Thereupon he changed his mind and also his previous orders. Ivanov, still believing that he was faced by the mass of the Austrian forces, had decided to pause for 48 hours so that his columns might close up and deploy for battle on the Neolippa. Had he pushed on at once it is likely that he would have crashed through the shaken Austrians as through a paper screen. The Grand Duke, when he heard of the halt, sent orders that the advance on Lemberg was to be resumed immediately. A remote commander-in-chief may propose, but his executive subordinates dispose the troops under their control. The Russian attack did not develop until the 30th, and even then its decisive impulse came, not from Ruzsky's army facing Lemberg, but from Brusilov, who had made a side step northward with the bulk of his army, the 8th by night, and then delivered a smashing blow with his right corps against one sector of the Austrian front. Its collapse produced a general reflux. The roads to the rear were congested with fugitives, intermingled with guns and transport. The Austrian official history candidly relates that a mere cry of the Cossacks are coming often sufficed to cause another panic surge. They were not coming, however, anything like as fast as in the Austrians' fears. Once more the Russians gave their enemy time to recover. They took nearly 3 days to advance the 18 miles which their fugitive opponents had covered in less than one. Then, their belated approach produced fresh panics, which opened such gaps on the enemy front that Conrad was constrained to abandon Lemberg late on September 2. But his enemy had given him time that he could not have gained. He used it, not to hedge, but to plunge more heavily, staking everything on the completion of his success in the north. Here, by the 30th, Offenberg's wings were well round Plev's flanks, while Dankel's right was driving a wedge between the two Russian armies. Confident of an early decision, Offenberg begged for 2 days' grace to achieve it. It was far easier for the local commander to ask than for Conrad to concede such an interval. He bore the responsibility for the whole and had to face the alarming fact that only 30 miles and a panicky mob separated Ruzsky and Brusilov from the communications of his own northern armies. Notwithstanding this grim situation, Conrad accepted Offenberg's plea and allowed him to retain the extra divisions. Like a left-handed swordsman beset by 2 adversaries, Conrad would guard his right side with a frail wicker shield while thrusting full out at the man in front of him. His willpower commands admiration. It would command unreserved admiration if one was sure that it was not fostered by self-delusion. Moreover, in the modern war of masses, the will of the commander-in-chief, however strong, cannot dominate those of the men upon whom he depends. His will not work unless his mind is attuned to theirs. In the events that now followed, the gulf between Conrad's ideas and the capacity of his instrument became manifest. On the night of the 30th, the commander of the menaced Russian Fifth Army sought to extricate himself by an order for withdrawal. That order might not have availed to save him if fortune had not on this occasion favored the discreet. Next morning the jaws of the trap, instead of closing, were drawn back. 2 archdukes controlled the jaws, Joseph on the right and Peter on the left. A solitary Austrian aeroplane, reconnoitering, magnified a handful of Russian cavalry into a division marching against Joseph's rear. He pulled back a large part of his force to guard it. On the other wing, the Austrian cavalry reported a similar threat, equally mythical, whereupon Peter drew back his whole force to cover his rear. Thus the Russians safely withdrew, leaving an empty battlefield. Too late, Offenberg the next morning ordered a rapid pursuit. Counter orders came from Conrad. These new orders were born of hope rather than of anxiety. It was unfortunate that Plev's army had not been surrounded, but to Conrad's eyes it was routed. It is fair to point out that he could only see the enemy's condition through the magnifying glass provided by subordinates, eager to flatter his hopes and enlarge their own achievements. Encouraged by this view of a Plev definitely removed from the board, Conrad conceived the picture of a new and greater encirclement. Offenberg should turn about and descend from the north upon the slowly advancing armies of Ruzsky and Brusilov, while the newly arrived Austrian Second Army should strike from the south against their other flank and lap round their rear. It was a masterly conception, which in breathtaking boldness was worthy of Napoleon. Unfortunately, Conrad's picture did not coincide with the reality of his opponent's situation and was affected by a change in their plans. Ivanov had ordered Ruzsky to incline northward, with Brusilov conforming, so that he might take in flank and rear the forces that were pursuing Plev. The effect on Conrad's plan was that this movement brought Ruzsky around to face the southbound Austrians, instead of presenting them his flank. Also, it contracted the space in which Offenberg could maneuver between his late and his new opponent. Even this might not have mattered if Conrad's instrument, the Austrian army, had been fitted for bold and swift maneuver. Its palpable unfitness formed Conrad's worst breach with reality. Moreover, a new danger was arising. There were now 2 armies instead of one facing his own extreme left. For the newly formed Russian Ninth Army had been brought down the Vistula to support the Fourth. While the latter pinned Dankel's army, the former was to push. Offenburg duly turned about and marched south, leaving the Archduke Joseph's divisions as a rearguard. The supposedly beaten Plevs also turned about and followed. On September 6 Offenburg, expecting to strike Ruzsky's flank, found Ruzsky knocking against his own at Rava-Ruska. Fortunately for him, Ruzsky was equally surprised, and this gave Offenburg a chance to face round. Away to the far south, Conrad's other pincer had been no more effective. The Austrian Second Army came too fresh to the fighting, but was travel-worn. Its advance soon petered out in a series of disjointed attacks, unsupported by artillery, which culminated in a rippling wave of panic during the night. When the tangle was straightened out, the Austrian Second, Third and Fourth Armies stood in a line facing east. The one clear fact that emerged was that the Russian armies were inclining northward. This inspired Conrad to the conception of yet another offensive design, regardless of the state of his troops. On the evening of September 8, Offenburg was given the task of holding the Russians who faced him, while the other two armies left their prepared defensive positions and wheeled northwards to roll up the Russian line. But the day of the 9th brought disillusionment. Brusilov was also intent on taking the offensive, and the two sides met head-on. The condition of the Austrian forces discounted their superiority of numbers, and the battle ended in stalemate, leaving each side with an exaggerated impression of the other's power. With faith unquenched, Conrad that night sent a fresh order to his armies for a concentric attack against the enemy on the Lemberg front. Next morning he went forward himself with the idea that his presence might be an encouragement. Not unnaturally, his presence at or rather behind one point of a 50-mile line made no appreciable difference. He sent an urgent message to the commander of the Second Army to attack without halting, vigorously and regardless of loss. The commander of the Second Army did not think the order worth passing on to the troops. Such orders were to be repeated so many thousand times on all sides during the World War that it would seem as if to those who uttered them, they had the virtue of a magic incantation. An economy of the phrase might have endowed it with more potency. It is rare to trace any effect on those to whom it was addressed, still less on the enemy. By his persistent pursuit of the tactically impossible, Conrad had engulfed his armies in a pit whence escape was hopeless, unless fortune threw them a line. Fortune relented and did so by a telegram that did not travel along a line. While Conrad's disordered forces were throwing themselves against the Russians near Lemberg in fulfillment of his plan and becoming more entangled in the process, dark masses of the enemy were looming across their rear. Away to the northwest, Dankel's isolated army was struggling to hold up the Russian 4th and 9th armies, double its strength, who were pushing down from the north. On the 9th Dankel warned Conrad that he could hold them no longer, but must fall back behind the Seine. Worse still, there was a 30-mile gap between Dankel's inner flank and Ruzsky's. Into this gap Plevs' army and a whole cavalry corps were marching, unseen and unforeseen by Conrad. But the ingenious Russian command came to his rescue in the nick of time. Early on the 11th the Austrians intercepted a wireless order which the Russians, according to their habit, had sent out unciphered. The order showed that Plevs' left wing was expected to reach points well behind Rava-Ruska by that evening. Still clutching at straws, Conrad delayed a few hours in the hope of a miracle on his other flank, and meantime sent an order for the remnant of the Archduke Joseph's divisions to drive back the intruding mass. Offenburg did not think such an order fit to pass on. So, in the afternoon, as no news of a miracle came, Conrad at last gave the order to disengage the armies and fall back behind the Seine as fast as possible. By one of history's strangest coincidences, it was at almost the same hour that Moltke accepted the inevitable and gave the order that converted the enforced withdrawal of his right wing into a general retreat of the German armies in France. The Austrian retreat, however, if less final, was far longer and harder. To quote the moving words of the Austrian official history, day and night behind a huge train of transport vehicles marched the infantry, with bowed heads, yet undiscouraged, sick. The artillery, sinking in up to their axles in the morass that the roads became the cavalry regiments, like horsemen of the apocalypse, in molten confusion, made their way on, their presence palpable from afar by the penetrating smell of the festering galls of hundreds of led horses. The deep churned mud of the roads luckily served as a brake on the inherently sluggish Russians. And frequent flickers of light from their wireless orders helped to guide the Austrians in evading interception. But Offenburg's troops could only do so by turning so far south that they became intermingled with the retreating tide of the Third Army. Less than two-thirds of the Austrian troops whom Conrad had confidently pushed forward in August reached the shelter of the San. Even there they did not tarry. They were so obviously unfit to fight that on September 16, when the first Russians approached, Conrad ordered a fresh retreat to the Dunajec, a farther 80 miles west, leaving behind the great fortress of Przemysl-its garrison as an obstacle to the pursuers. Conrad would, almost surely, have saved himself and his country this additional draft of gall if he had abstained from his last futile assaults near Lemberg. But his rosy imagination had prevented him. This had certainly revived when, after the war, he wrote in his memoirs. The Austro-Hungarian armies were not beaten. They had to be withdrawn to escape a situation that might well have led to a defeat if the battle had continued. From this they were saved. He saved them from annihilation but not from ruin. He had lost some 350,000 men out of 900,000, and the survivors had retreated over 150 miles, abandoning the province of Galicia. But the ultimate effects were worse than the immediate results. Conrad had juggled with armies and broken them. If he was able to collect the pieces and stick them together with German glue, they never again had a sound ring.